everyone. Welcome back to the NB Polypod. My name is Joanna Killen. I'm here in the unceded territory of the Wolastoqey, Mi'kmaq, and Pescatomakati people in Menaquest, also known as St. John. I'm here with my co-host, Brent Harris. And yes, hello. From the upstairs to the downstairs.
That's right. Yeah.
It's this week's exciting because we're having a guest back on the show. Jerry Iwwanus. And I just want to start off by saying a major thank you to our donor, a patron, if you will, Darlene, who this is her favorite topic. Tax reform, property taxes. She's been very outspoken towards me and her feelings about this. And I feel that it's such a serendipitous week to have Jerry here to talk about this topic, which is her favorite, after her very generous donation to the pod this week. So thank you, Darlene.
And another shout out to the Premier, who apparently is listening, Susan Holt. Thank you for messaging us. You never know where this goes. The fact that Darlene gave us a big donation is huge. We never know who this reaches. We just see the couple hundred that download the podcast every week, and then we see the 100 or so that watch it on YouTube. But who else out there is seeing and know it? But like the fact that Susan Holt, she was chiming in a lot last year when the snap election call was being announced. We actually had some. If you go back, you might hear us mention some comments by Susan back then when she was the opposition leader. But she just said this on Sunday. She said, Brent, just catching up on a pod that we wanted to let you know that the Premier is constitutionally required to be the Minister of Official Languages. Blaine was, and every Premier since the act was passed was. So it wasn't a choice, but rather a must do, just so you know next time. And I said, thank you so much, Susan. I actually had no clue that was a requirement. And I didn't know that the Premier was like Premier Higgs was the Minister of Official Languages last time as well. Anyway, so we love being corrected. We absolutely love bearing ourselves before the public, if you will, with our inaccuracies and trying to make those known. So Susan, would love to have you on the show, because I'm sure there's dozens of other things that little brats like me get wrong when we're being critical of government. Of course, there would be no hesitation.
Come put Brent in his place. It can't just be me doing that, Premier. But yes, let's get into this week, because we are so excited to have Jerry
let's bring Jerry in to actually have a proper conversation. Jerry, how are you?
I'm great. How are you guys?
Oh, we're just thrilled to have you. Like I said, we're just talking about all of our wrongs and all of our mistakes. And
listen, Jerry's corrected us too.
That's right. You've made more than a few corrections. And I just every time I get a chance, it's like, you know what, guys, I was wrong. You were right. I can change. Maybe, I guess, if I have to. It's like the Red Green Show. Remember that the motto of the man or whatever.
I'm honored to be here, and I'm really quite tickled that you got support like that from someone like Darlene, who obviously cares about this issue too. It's people like her that are required to push some things ahead in this. So good for her. That's just super.
Yeah, and Darlene, goodness, thank you again. We always love our Patreon supporters, but Darlene said to us, "Hey, I don't know how to navigate the online piece around Patreon. Not comfortable, putting a credit card online." We understand that. That's just like the simplest, low-hanging fruit for us to platform and to accept donations. But if you want to write us a check or bring us $5, come have a coffee with us. For anybody listening, just so you know, those are all options as well, and we really appreciate it, and it helps keep all the subscriptions paid for. And but anyway, today, Jerry, we have a huge topic. The last time, I think that conversation last time really set the stage for where we're at now. You talked about this missing lens of equity in our system. You talked about tax policy being embedded into our tax department, and how that's problematic. And you talked about differences from your experiences. But now we are on a whole different planet. We have a new government, and you have a new book.
Yes.
Which is it's out and ready. And I'm going to find a picture of it. But can you tell us a little bit about, just remind the audience, because there's new listeners, your background, as well as what your mission was with this book.
Yeah, sure. And the book is only a part of the broader mission. I have I worked in property valuation for 20 years, 16 and a half of those in Alberta and 3 and a half of those here as an assessor with Service New Brunswick. But I've also been the mayor of a small municipality. I have also been on an area assessment review board in Alberta. I have been a property owner. I have been a landlord. So I've kind of seen what's going on in New Brunswick in a whole bunch of different levels. And plus I have Alberta as a basis of comparison, but not the only basis of comparison. So I come to New Brunswick. I work at Service New Brunswick. I like the people I work with. I had no complaints about any of that. I was treated well there. But I found very quickly that the system here was very different. And the main reason for that is that people would blame assessors for their tax increases. And that's not where the blame for those increases should lie. And I tired of that. And eventually I decided I'm just going to retire from the industry as a whole. And so then after that, I decided I decided to write a book. I've got something to say about this. I'm free of the shackles of government in terms of I can say what I want to say. So I wrote the book. And the book is, thanks for posting that, it's Taxing New Brunswick, an insider's guide to successfully challenging your NB property assessment. And that's what the book really is. It's a how-to guide to challenge your assessment, because it talks about the things that you should do, the things that you shouldn't do, and so forth. I got into bits and pieces in the book as to how I think the system should be changed, but that's not the main place where I've got that. For anybody that's interested, I've written a lot about property assessment and taxation in New Brunswick. It's on my website. It's called theprairiemaritimer.com. theprairiemaritimer.com. There's a whole section there that says New Brunswick, and I talk about these things at some length, because truth be told, if I could do the book again, there's probably some things I would already change in it. There's some things that I've learned along the way, and I've incorporated those into some more recent articles. And I'm also writing a series of articles on assessment for the Northumberland Free Press, which is a subscription page on Substack. So we're at a golden opportunity here. There's a change of government. The government has indicated it's interested in change. Now is the time. The time is ripe to put those suggestions there. And so just this morning, I'm shipping a box full of 31 books to each of the Liberal MLAs so that they have a copy of that, plus a copy of all of the articles I've written on this. And I know that TJ News, John Chillibeck at TJ News, did a story on me a couple of weeks ago where I called the assessment system garbage, and I stand by that. And then he talked to the Minister of Local Government, Honorable Aaron Kennedy, and told him that I was going to be sending books. And the minister said, well, I'm looking forward to reading that. So this is a chance for people like Darlene and me and you guys and whoever else wants to have some impact. Because once they put new legislation in place, it's going to be it would be a bigger problem to change it. Now the time is right for hopefully some of these suggestions that we're going to discuss fall on fertile ground.
Trying to make these comparisons to where we were, where we're at now, this new fertile ground that we're sitting on to make some changes. I think it's important to say, let's just start it off with what's at stake. We have people pay taxes on their property, industries pay taxes on their property, businesses pay taxes on their property, on their land, all of that. What are those notable differences that you have seen in your background, Jerry, in your research, your involvement? We recognize that we're not trying to railroad the property assessors or any of it. We are trying to highlight those gaps, those blind spots in the Tax Act, and try to illuminate that. But what are some of those notable differences that you've seen that you talk about in this book?
Well, there are two things. First of all, there are two acts at play, and one is the Assessment Act, and one is the Real Property Tax Act. And the biggest problem, everything else is subsumed by this. The biggest problem is the fact that there is this marriage between assessment and taxes in New Brunswick that doesn't exist in any other jurisdiction that adheres to the standards of the International Association of Assessing Officers. And the basis of that is that there's this incestuous relationship between taxes and assessments. Like if you open the Assessment Act, there's all sorts of reference to taxes in there and so forth. Shouldn't be there. It shouldn't be there. They went one step after 2017 to separate notice. We don't get a notice now that has assessment and taxes on it. We get a separate assessment notice and then a separate notice for tax. But so much of what governs tax policy is found in the Assessment Act, and that is just at its very base a problem. You see, assessment is an administrative function. It is performed by people to decide. Properties are valued in an ad valorem tax system. Properties are valued so that the government can figure out who has the ability to pay more, who has the ability to pay less. Your house is a statement of what you're able to pay in terms of taxes. And that's all assessment should be. Tax policy, on the other hand, is a political function, not an administrative one. Politicians decide. You guys, even on St. John Council, decide what the tax rate is going to be based on what you think your needs are. And those things, once those things get melded together, it becomes a problem. So what happens is what I mentioned before is that, you can work in assessment and then assessments go up. All of a sudden taxes go up too. They shouldn't. And then the assessors are blamed for rising taxes. That alone is where the problem is in the system. Those things need to be separated out into a revised Assessment Act and a revised Real Property Tax Act at the very basis of everything else that's going to happen. So let's just start there.
So let's start with that because, yeah, exactly. I think that's a big statement. You say there's this body that oversees, sort of regulates tax assessment. What'd you call the International
Association of Assessing Officers?
Right. So that's an accrediting body. It's an accredited institution. Is it regulatory of any kind?
Yeah, to my understanding. Yeah.
Okay. So, these guys oversee all the provinces in Canada, I would assume.
They don't oversee anything. It's an organization. It doesn't have any power. It's an association that.
Sorry. By oversee, I mean that, right. Like they are associated with engaged with every taxing authority in the country. Is that correct? Do we have outliers? Are there no?
Not necessarily. No, I mean,
okay.
The assessors would be aware of them, but a province like New Brunswick that doesn't choose to adhere to the very basic concept of revenue neutral taxation, which is what I'm talking about by separating tax and assessment. I
see.
You know what? I'm not going to pretend I'm an expert on how the IAAO operates and how
of course
use their information. But
yeah, I just want to get them placed right because we have agents that go out and they have a guidebook on assessing properties, and they go out and they have an intention to look at the existing resting price or assessment of a property. They analyze the market realities. They engage, I assume, a range of variables, and they bring that into a bit of a formula or in a bit of an equation. And they obviously don't do building to building, property to property. They often do kind of wide swaths of different parts.
Called mass appraisal. Yeah.
Mass appraisals. And then, of course, so you get that now in the mail. It doesn't have your tax bill associated with your property assessment, which is an important thing because I see what you say. When you say it's incestuous, I see what you mean. It's like one hand isn't really supposed to talk to the other. They're not supposed to be guiding each other. And what is it that, right now you're pointing to the fact that right now they do in New Brunswick? And so is this normal for provinces, or is New Brunswick just sort of an extreme outlier on that?
I can't speak to all provinces, but it certainly wasn't the case in Alberta like that as an example.
Right.
I'll give you one particular thing that New Brunswick does where this incestuous relationship is a problem. We've got here what's called the spike protection mechanism. And that means that if your property value goes up more than 10%, they will limit the assessment increase to 10% per year. Now, if your value goes up 30 or 40%, as was the case in certain types of property over the past few years, they will limit the increase in the assessment every year to 10%. So in other words, because they want to limit how much extra tax you're going to pay in a given year. So what are they doing? They're using an assessment function to deal with what's at heart a property tax issue. So instead of just lowering the bloody rate the way they should and applying it to all properties, instead they apply this stupid spike protection mechanism that supposedly protects people. It does nothing of the sort. All it does is delay the increases that they can expect in future years, because assessments and tax rates are still they're still not revenue neutral. Taxes still go up when assessments do. They've just controlled the extent of that as to how when it happens. They spread it out instead of it all happening at once.
I'm just wondering if that would also be like a bureaucratic nightmare to facilitate, like all these spike protection applications and everything else that they're having to do as a result of that piece.
You are bang on correct. Like when I was in assessment, I mean, we had to go over properties to see which ones were eligible for the spike protection mechanism, blah, blah, blah. And it all fell on assessment to do this extra work. And if anybody thinks that government workers don't work hard, they haven't seen assessment people in action, I'll tell you. But everybody thinks that, it's easy peasy. No, give it to assessment. They'll fix it. Just lower the frickin' tax rate. I almost said it back there.
I love your line. I want to make sure that we don't lose track of the big picture here. I mean, what is it like? Taxes it's a frustrating topic. No one likes taxes. Everybody loves services. Everybody wants more services, less taxes. We get it, right? But I think why it's important for them, why we're talking about it today from a provincial perspective, we have all kinds of outliers, it seems, in our experience around who pays what taxes, where. We're under the gun right now for immense growth pressure. You know, we had the director of our economic development agency in to speak to council a few weeks ago. And one of the things I pushed back on, they were sort of creating this narrative, or Andrew was sort of establishing this narrative that, you know, we need to be concerned about the fact that immigration taps are being turned off because New Brunswick has, and St. John has benefited pretty significantly from this and blah, 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 blah. And, you know, workforce and all this stuff. And it's like, of course. But I said, you know, Andrew, don't you think that we are still such an under-assessed market on a per capita basis for our housing costs? We're still seen as a very affordable market in the grand scheme of this nation, one. And two, we've seen most of the pressure around our growth come from interprovincial migration. You know, we're not seeing, you know, that like with the extra 50,000 people or whatever have come to New Brunswick in the last number of years.
It's more than that. It's
It's like, I think we're up to, whatever it is. I'm just thinking of different
it was
starting points, but
785,000 when we moved here in mid 2019. It's now well over 850. So
cruising. So we're cruising up toward 100,000 more people. You know, the lion's share of them are not immigrants. The lion's share of them are people like yourself, Jerry, over the last 5 years who have moved from other provinces because, like, hey, this is an affordable place. It's got a great quality, good cities. You got access. It's like, you know, there's jobs here, like all of that, right? It's a different game. But I think the reason I say all this is because it's important to place the conversation around taxation and to really get this right now, because we have this new government that has claimed it has a mandate here to fix some of these outlier pieces, to fix this incestuous relationship, as you called it, and hopefully from a municipal governance perspective, fix the idea of tax classes so that we don't bake in and lock in this complexity forever, that we can fix it. I guess when you talk about spike protection and the administrative burden that puts on assessors who are paid for by the province, what kind of workload are we talking about freeing up? What would you like to see, or maybe what surprised you when you came from Alberta doing that work to New Brunswick doing this work? Like, how did your activities, your day-to-day work differ in New Brunswick than Alberta? What stuck out?
Yeah, well, it's a bit of a problem to make that comparison, because when I was in Alberta, I owned my own private appraisal business. I wasn't on the assessment side, But that having been said, I worked with a lot of assessors. We exchanged information. I was in an area where I talked to at least half a dozen assessors on a regular basis to get sales and all sorts of things like that there. So it's different coming here. It's different. The government position was an entirely different focus, and I knew it would be. I was able to apply some of my valuation skills, but I was not. It's not like jumping from private practice to government, and it's all the same thing, because assessment for tax purposes is an entirely different function.
Okay, so now let's dive into the moment. You mentioned that there's the Assessment Act and the Tax Act. What are some specific changes that we like, and opening up an act? Like, first, I think it's important to say, like, we have a government, we have some mandate letters. What stuck out to you about, Aaron Kennedy, local government, being the minister there, as well as, I think you said the Minister of Treasury or Finance?
Yeah, Finance and Treasury Board, yeah.
Yeah, which is Renee Legacy?
That is correct.
So those two have positions of oversight over this system to some extent. What stuck out to you in those mandate letters?
That's a great question. And that's an easy one to answer. Although it didn't say this specifically in the mandate letter in terms of a time frame, the government had promised, even when they were campaigning, they had promised to have something in place by 2026. That is an absolutely unrealistic time frame to produce the kind of reform that the system needs. You're talking about not only reopening two major acts and realigning their focus, taking away the relationship between tax and assessment in the Assessment Act, and allowing tax rates to float freely in the Real Property Tax Act. That's major all by itself. That doesn't even begin to take into account what the government has to do to coordinate that, along with a proper funding formula for municipalities. You guys are screaming for a better funding formula, and rightfully so. Infrastructure deficit coming out of the yin yang, it's horrible. So somehow they've got to get those two major acts fixed, and they're going to get pushback on all sorts of parts of trying to do that. And then at the same time, coordinating that with municipal reform financing. And by the way, there is things like, healthcare and education and maybe some other things on the agenda. And they want to get all this done within a year. So here's what I'm really scared of. I am scared that they are going to tinker with this, not introduce the truly fundamental change that's needed in the four areas that I can talk about. And they're going to say, yeah, we kept our promise. We did something. But by tinkering, in my opinion, they're only going to make it worse, because it's going to be putting Band-Aids over some gaping wounds that require things like tourniquets and surgery. And it's going to be a problem. That's the big thing, is they're going to try and push this ahead in a year. And they want to if they even consider talking to people, to talking to stakeholders, and to dealing with the opposition that's going to come from different quarters to different parts of that reform, and to do all that and have it in place for the assessment notices January 1st next year, that is a frickin' pipe dream if I've ever heard one.
Yeah, because it takes about 18 months to open up a piece of legislation and see it through.
Just to do that alone. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Just exactly. But if they tinker, I mean, Blaine Higgs was talking, we don't need to change anything. All we need to do is fiddle with the tax rates. So he was way off base. Now this government's got its heart in the right place. I am not, and I have a lot of respect for Susan Holt. I have a lot of respect for the people that she has put into cabinet, but I'm not firmly convinced that they have the depth of understanding that is required to do the kind of changes that New Brunswick needs to see to make this legislation and this system more fair, equitable, and so that people have some confidence in it.
So, where do we start, Jerry? Where does this government begin?
Where does it start?
Yeah, how could they start on this pathway to say have this done in 5 years, let's say?
Well, they should start by reading, my book, and
which they're going to have a free copy of, so nobody can fault them.
they can start there. I think they have to listen widely. Maybe 3 years they can do it. Maybe it won't take 5, but I think they have to have public hearings and listen widely to people and the different stakeholders. I'll give you some examples. I mean, if they push for revenue neutrality so that taxes don't go up when assessments do, they will get some pushback from municipalities, because municipalities have been benefiting from that over a long period of time. So they had better put a different system into place to fund municipalities properly to offset the free money they've been getting from assessments that are higher than are budgeted for. They're going to get pushback, and they already have. I've seen it, pushback from industry in terms of different, more tax rates for different classes of property. They're going to get pushback there. And God love them, but they're going to get pushback from the assessment people if they introduce assessment equity into the act, because essentially the entire province will have to be reassessed. And whether they have the technology in place and the people to do all that, it's not going to be easy. So there's going to be push if they want to do really fundamental reform that will really bring New Brunswick up to the standards that provinces like Alberta and BC and Ontario are at. Not that those provinces don't have their own problems, but if they want to bring the standard up here, right now the International Association of Assessing Officers says that New Brunswick system is not a fair and equitable system because it's tax rate driven rather than budget driven. If they
I just want to stop you there. Just sorry to interrupt,
Sure.
because I think that is a crucial piece to this understanding. And you mentioned it before in the podcast we did with you previously. It's also in your book. We need to have a needs-based budget so that our tax rates have this free-floating approach to them. And what does that require us to do? How does it tie into the problems we have? Like, it ties into the problems I think we have, where people have more and more reason to distrust their government, to distrust the process, to go invade their own capital, to say they couldn't do anything properly. Like, we have a pretty major democratic deficit as a country right now. Big disconnect between political leaders and the public, and it's more and more conspiracies. There's more and more disruption. There's more and more crises that continue to plague us, and it's like, here is just another reason why property owners, who are really militant in some cases, they can be quite militant property owners, can hold these positions and these belief systems, because they can point to this, glaring problem in our tax system. They can point to different groups. Not that I think a lot of people are holding, a lot of information, and they're not people that don't have a high level of awareness of how this works, but they instinctively see it. They know it doesn't make sense. Exactly. I don't like it. I don't trust it. And what more could you, like, when you talk about getting budgets that are clear? So we say St. John or Pictou or whoever, or whatever place needs $200 million to deliver its appropriate service levels as well as its infrastructure. And so we're not going to take $220 million because tax assessments came in and said your house was worth $500,000 when it was worth $350,000. We're not going to take that extra cash. The rate just gets reduced. We stay at $200 million if that's what we need. But I don't know of anybody who has that outlook. I don't know of any municipality in this province. Maybe I don't even know of any municipality that communicates this well as to what they need to run and deliver an A-level tier service or a B-level. So I guess that's my question to you, and that's the disconnect, because I agree instinctively municipalities should have a budget requirement that they hold up, and then their tax rate should come and collect those taxes. And you know what? If your taxes go up, it's too bad. The city can't fail.
Right.
You live in it. So you're stuck here. And move, I guess. It's hard conversation, not easy, but the converse is true, or the opposite is true. where it's like, well, we only needed 200 million, so we're not going to take your extra assessment increase. So
Well,
it works both ways.
You as the politicians should face the music for what the taxes are, and not the assessors. That's the difference here. So again, I draw on Alberta, not because Alberta's got everything right. For God's sake, they got Danielle Smith as a premier, so they don't have everything right. But and the assessment system worked. Here's how it worked there, and here's how it made sense to work, because it was rarely an issue. Is that when I was on council, we would ask the chief administrative officer, okay, what's our overall assessment for this year? She would give us the overall assessment. We sit down, hammer out the budget. Where should we increase spending? Where should we decrease? What should happen? And we say, we need X amount of money to operate. And then we set the tax rate at that. And that's it. So I'll give it a mathematical example that should translate well over video. Let's say that the village needed $100,000 to operate, and we had $1 million worth of assessment. Those figures aren't real, but just for the math's sake.
Sure.
Obviously, to get $100,000, you need 10% tax rate, right? Makes sense so far?
Yep.
Next year, the assessment goes up by 20%. So it goes up to 1.2 million. But let's say we still only need $100,000 to operate. So what do? We lower the tax rate so that it offsets that 20%, and the tax rate becomes 8.3%. We still get that same $100,000. Now, if we need $110,000 to operate, then we have to look the taxpayers in the eye and say, we need this extra money to operate, so the tax rate won't go down as far as that. Do you know what I'm saying?
And therein lies the problem. Nobody wants, I think that's why we don't have needs-based budgets, because nobody wants to face the music. I can tell you this, if I took a needs-based budget to the public of this city, everybody's tax rates are going up a lot. Well, yeah, because our infrastructure deficit is so enormous for, this. We don't, and there's programs out there from different levels of government to help our infrastructure problems. But, everybody is sort of treated the same, despite the fact that, we just replaced, Abraham Lincoln era pipes 3 years ago. It's like, we don't all have the same problem, but we all have the same system to, and this would be the hard part I would have about creating a needs-based budget for this city. With my colleagues, with Joe, it's like we wouldn't want to raise people's taxes to the extent that is, I think, required.
Right. Well, I, with all due respect, I think you're on a slightly different side of where I was going with that.
Right.
I don't argue that municipalities need more money, and they should get it in proper negotiations with the province, whether it be a GST point or whatever you come up with in that regard. That's not what's at issue. The issue is that right now municipalities get the extra money that they often need just because the assessments have gone up.
Right.
That's the way it should operate. Now, even in the way the media covers these discussions in New Brunswick, every story is about the assessment and it's about the tax rate. If you go to a place like Alberta or British Columbia, the media stories are about what's in the budget. How much more do they need to operate? The media stories here are all focused on the tax rate driven system because that's what we've got. That's where I'm talking about this incestuous relationship between the two that permeates everything else that happens in the system. You're talking about municipal funding. We need municipal funding. It just shouldn't come about by the accident of increased assessments. It should come about because you have had a conversation about it with your taxpayers, and you as councillors are comfortable voting for what it is that you need, or negotiating with the province to say we need a different distribution, more equitable, or more diverse revenue sources and so forth. That has to happen. It shouldn't happen by the accident of increased assessments. I call that a stealth tax. Really do.
And it's a struggle, really, because we actually just was having this conversation with a colleague about, do we want to put that additional financial pressure on the citizens right now when there's all these other affordability problems, and we have control of that number we can ask for. Exactly. And I know next year, we're shifting towards a service-based budget, and one sort of step towards what you're talking about. Still not quite there, but it is like, I know that your words are echoing through City Hall in St. John to some extent, because we need to define what we need better. And that is on us as municipal councillors. And it is on us to say, we're not going to take an assessment windfall. We have, just because there is an extra $10 million to have doesn't mean we should have it. We're only going to be spending this much anyway. So I think,
Exactly.
your point's definitely taken with me personally. It's echoed in my head so much. And I see people turning some of your quotes in your book into like memes and stuff like that. Pam Ross, shout out for doing that. Because it's true. We need as municipal councillors to accept responsibility for the system at hand.
Yeah.
And make decisions based on that. Yeah.
And to your point, Joe, I think what you could have is you could have some work done by your finance committee, like we have a finance committee, or by, your council, to say, here's the system we got, so here's the budget and here's the tax rate this year. But just so everybody knows, here's what the city actually needed. And we're going to hold that up as a bit of a scorecard to say, if we had some of these reforms that we're asking for, like the city of St. John has at least 5 requests into the province for reforms. Like, I think we can list them. We want to keep the provincial, a much larger portion of the industrial taxes, right? We just saw a pretty massive article hit the waves there, picked up by Canadian Accountant, picked up by written by TJ News, written by John Schilleback. It's the title, a $29 million fight over big industry taxes. Yeah. Right? We have that problem where there's an exodus of capacity leaving the city and going to the province that other cities just don't have because they don't have such large industries. So we have that reform in. We have, and this is just for St. John. Moncton has their own. Fredericton has different ones, I know, but we know this one the best. But every municipality has these requests in for changes to either the legislation or policy or whatever. And it occurs to me that, like, within that, there's not really anybody holding up, here could be the different world we all live in, St. John. If we had these changes, here's what our budget would look like. Here's what your tax bill would look like. And here's what's at stake, right? We just have asks. We don't have it tied to an outcome people can see.
You know what? I'd like to say that there are, and I'm going to talk about exactly what you said there, but I'm going to put this in a bit of a point form. There are 4 things that I think need to change. One is, we've talked about already, revenue neutrality. Taxes shouldn't go up just because assessments do. The second one you just touched on is the relationship between residential and non-residential tax rates, and the inability to, to split those apart, to tax different segments of properties in a different way. Right now, there's a 170% rule, which is that your non-residential tax rate cannot be more than 170% of your residential tax rate. Well, that ties your hands significantly, because what happens is that when the res assessments go up by 10% and non-res assessments only go up by 2 or 3%, that there's, even if the municipality wanted to be revenue neutral, they couldn't, because it would mess with that 170%. And I can't do this on here in terms of showing you the figures and that, but believe me, I've done the work.
And the city of St. John has put that information out too. We've seen tax rate multipliers, we call them. You're talking about the 170%. That 1.7 multiplier in some jurisdictions in Alberta, there's 450% multiplier.
500%. You took the words right out of my mouth. That's exactly where I was going with that. So that's another one. The third issue with assessments is, I think that people often see that assessments are nowhere close to what people kind of know what market value is in a given area, and
right.
So way under. And now you think, well, if those assessments were a little higher, it really reflected market value better. And sometimes there's reasons why they are the way they are, and I'm not sure that Service New Brunswick does a great job explaining that, but people are losing confidence in the system when they know that there's been several properties that have sold in, say, the 50,000 range, and the assessments are all at 22,000. That's tax revenue that's foregone, and it undermines people's confidence in the system. And of course, the fourth thing I think needs to change, we've talked about too, is assessment equity, that people can't challenge their assessments on the basis of their house the neighbor's identical house being assessed differently. You wish you were able to do that, but you can't. Those are the 4 things that I think are key. I don't talk about those in the book so much, but I do in the articles that I've written. And
so
that's a conversation I want the government to include in its thinking when it's making changes.
I know that Joanna and I, we joked about this, Joanna, and just remembered the phrase we had: if you want a break, go to Turner and Drake.
Right.
This that came out of the last podcast because we got digging around with this firm out of Halifax, which is basically just quarterbacked by the billionaire class here in this province to go down, hire Turner Drake, get them to come here, get them to frig with the assessors, get them to frig with the courts, and file all these different grievances and get the province tied up to the point where they give them what they ask for in many cases.
That's one of my articles that I wrote back when we first talked.
Yeah,
is the role of tax agents. Tax agents have a role to play. There's no question about it. This isn't anything personal against tax agents. I know some of them, and some of them are just fine people. That's not a problem. But the system is geared towards what you just said there, where there's a lot of breaks that come about because of what tax agents are able to do for corporations that have money. And so if all assessments get lowered on that side because they've made this argument or that, residential owners are going to have to pick up the slack eventually. And I know I'm not going to make any friends with tax agents saying that, but it's the truth. They got to do their job. I think they play too much of a role in the system, and I'm not sure the system serves the average property owner very well the way it's structured right now.
Well, no, it's not the tax agent's fault that the system is built this way, right? We run into that a lot where, I referred to this constituent conversation last week talking about, certain companies can do whatever they want and they don't have to, they're not accountable. It's like, well, they're experts in our system, probably more than the government even is on some fronts. So, their ability to not even manipulate, but sort of take things that are written in the Tax Act as it stands and go and argue that is not the tax agent's fault, but it does not speak to equity when, if you're a senior or somebody who is not educated in any of that, they have no ability to go challenge their tax.
That's right.
The same way.
Hopefully my book helps more average people balance their assessments, which is fine because it's really geared towards the single family property owner or the small landlord or that kind of thing. But the other issue related to, it's not just tax agents too, because regular property owners do this too, is that they send in so many requests for review. And in agents' case, they will often withdraw some of those later because they know that they're not really, the assessment is fine, but they want to gum up the system because then often assessors will just look at it and go, well, we got to get through this stuff. So if they gum up the system, assessors are not, they spend a ton of the time during the year doing requests for review. Then all of a sudden they don't have time to go out and do re-inspections of other properties. And that's why you end up with properties that are assessed for $20,000 when you know that they're somewhere in the 50 or 60,000 range. The system as a whole is just, it's not designed. And you know what? I'm going to speak in New Brunswick's defense in this, because if you read stuff like from, say, BC, they will say the exact same thing. This isn't the tax agent thing is not a New Brunswick problem. This is the way the property tax system is structured across Canada problem. It's a different, I would argue it's probably the same in the States too, although I don't know that for a fact.
Do you think,
these are all issues that need to be addressed in any kind of comprehensive reform, and they're not going to be within a year.
What if we look at this from a different lens and we say, and this is where I'm curious what you would think, because I think I hear what you're saying. There's a lot at stake with properties, right? This system needs to work in order for people to contribute to their community. If we don't have taxes, if we're not taxing people's properties, we can't deliver services. So that's at stake, right? There's no such thing as libertarian snow removal. Nobody's shoveling out the road all the way down to their neighbors. It's a community-wide initiative, right? It is whatever. But I guess what my curiosity is, property tax systems are not the only tax assessment, or are not the only systems that we can use. We could use something like a land value tax. How familiar are you with that? It's like this idea of gumming up the system because you have a different opinion about the value of your house because you just put vinyl siding on or you just put board and batten on, and what does that do to the actual market demand of your property and blah 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 blah. What to me, it's such a bad way to organize your tax collection requirement when everything comes down to services, right? Like you should be taxed based on the services that you enjoy. I mean, if I've got to dig my own well and dig my own septic and do all that, I shouldn't be paying the same tax bills or tax rates or whatever. I don't think that somebody who gets city water and has pipes running under them and all the same thing. But how experienced are you with this land value tax idea, this idea that we set a tax rate on the land, and if you build a mansion on it, great. If you build whatever on it, it doesn't change the tax that's on the land.
I'm not an expert at it, but I'm familiar with it. And we had considered doing something similar when I was mayor of the village of Banff in Alberta, because, we had properties sitting there that were not being developed, and there was no incentive to do so because they were paying, minimal property tax on it. So we had considered it, but, it would not, we couldn't have done that just as a village. That would have required changes to the Municipal Government Act in Alberta, as I'm sure it would here. It's a different way of deciding who's able to pay and who's not. I think it's worthy of discussion, but I'm not an expert on it. You could probably talk to somebody that would know that a lot better than I would.
No, it's interesting you guys looked at it though, because you don't even see that conversation, like outside of publications like Strong Towns, you don't see a lot of people talking about land value taxes and stuff.
Because we do it all, we same old. We're all doing different variations of essentially the same system. It's an ad valorem tax system that says the value of your property is what determines what you're able to pay towards services. One interesting thing we did that ties into what you were saying when I was mayor of the village of Banff is we had a more detailed property tax bill. We showed what part of that bill was going towards say streets, what part of that was going towards garbages, what part of that was going towards water and sewer over and above what people were paying on their own bills. So people had a clearer idea of where those tax dollars were actually going. And I realize the village of Banff and the city of St. John are not the same thing. And the city of St. John spends on a lot of different things and has a much broader mandate, especially on social issues and things like that the village of Banff would have not. But I found that those things, people could at least look at it and say, okay, that's where that portion of my taxes is going. And it obviated a discussion about at least that portion of things, Thought you might find that interesting anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's clever. And I think it's, people sometimes feel like to Brent's point, like, well, I'm on a well and I'm still having to pay the same thing. So what is it in Martinon versus the uptown area, for instance, in terms of what you're paying for? It would be hard to do because considering the diversity of neighborhoods we have, but I think it would be interesting to see what, someone on Germain Street's paying for versus somebody in Martinon kind of thing.
Yeah.
Which are just two separate types of neighborhoods we have, rural versus urban.
I get that conversation too, and have had that conversation with several other people recently related to other places. Of course, that also ties into the argument of people that live, just outside city limits. They're not getting all the city services. But on the other hand, they drive into the city and work every day. They use the recreational facilities within the city and so forth. So should they be paying, I don't know about more tax, but should they not be complaining about what they do have to pay because they benefit from all that as well? And I got news for you. That's not just a New Brunswick conversation. That's a conversation that's absolutely everywhere. Some places in Alberta, like the Wood Buffalo area where Fort McMurray is located, or Strathcona County where Sherwood Park and all the refineries are, they've just combined that into one big fat municipality, and that gets rid of that discussion. So they all benefit. People in Sherwood Park and people in the acreages around it, they're all, benefiting from the same things. They're all using those rec facilities. So that kind of combination of, they've sort of done that here with some of the municipal restructuring, but maybe haven't gone far enough to deal with some of those issues about the fairness of taxation beyond city boundaries.
Yeah, we have a big problem with it here in St. John. I would say again, it's a bit of the problem. Like when you look at Moncton or look at Fredericton, like they have bedroom communities like Riverview, or, you know,
Oh,
they
yeah.
have bedroom communities like Lincoln and Woodstock and, you know, people further out and stuff. But the issue around St. John, I think, is so much more protracted because of the sheer volume of people coming into the city to work these, you know, major industrial site jobs.
Yeah.
So it's one of those things where, you know, when I first came on council, they were telling us about St. John being one of the only municipalities in the country that has an inverse property tax assessment reality, where the closer you get to the core, the less expensive the properties are, which creates this, which creates the, and that's not so much true anymore. There's been some pretty major assessment changes, but back in 2021, my goodness, you know, you start in Quispam Sis and your house was valued at $400,000, $250,000. By the time you got to Uptown St. John, you were down to like 280.
Interesting.
You know, and that creates this hollow, you know, no ability to drive density, no ability to synergize your service delivery, no ability.
It's a donut. Yeah, it becomes a donut. Yeah, it's.
But yeah, so we have these three. We're kind of getting close to time, so I want to make sure we bring it back to the property owner, to the individual listening on this podcast that owns a house that you know, has to care about their budget. They have to care about what they're paying and contributing and seeing. Like, let's bring it home to that level. Your book gives an analysis on how to effectively challenge your property tax assessment. Are you just teaching people how to gum up the system, as you talked about? Is that what this is about?
Well, that's actually a really good question. If you read the book carefully, there's a section in there that says very clearly, if these are your circumstances, don't bother challenging. And I was hoping that a lot of people would look at that and say, I'm not going to challenge because of this. There's only one reason that you should challenge. And actually, and I had a discussion with Bob Jones about this just yesterday. There's only one reason that you should challenge, and that is if your assessment is higher than what you think your property would sell for. Now, what your property would sell for will be affected by things that the assessor may not know about. And that would include the condition of the property, many times inside where the assessor may not have seen for ages, but it might be affected by something outside, like if you live next to a crack house or something like that. Your property the assessor doesn't know these things, so you challenge your assessment, because if the assessor knew these things, the property would be valued for less. And that is a legitimate challenge. But I also have a list of, I can't remember what it is, 9 reasons why you shouldn't challenge your assessment. And those include things like, my taxes are too high. Sorry, that doesn't count. It's because the services in my neighborhood are substandard. Sorry, that doesn't count either, because everybody else in this neighborhood has the same substandard services. You can't challenge just because your assessment increased a bunch in 1 year. You can't challenge that, because all that really means is that assessors have finally brought it up to market standard. And guess what? You've been getting away with paying less than your fair share for all those years. So you can't challenge on that basis. And as we've already discussed, you can't challenge on the basis of equity. So I was hoping with my book that I would do 2 things. One is to, head them off at the pass. Only challenge if it's a legitimate complaint that your assessment is higher than what your value is. If it's any of this other stuff, don't bother challenging. Don't waste your time, because that's not what you should be spending your time on. You should be spending time like your listener that donated money, or like what I'm doing, is trying to fight the system at a different level where the real problems are, and not complaining about taxes and other things while you're filing a request for assessment review. So I've tried to head people off at the pass a little bit about that.
Mm-hmm.
I've got, I assume we're getting close to time here.
We're getting close to time, but there's one, I want to go to Joanna. She's trying to chime in.
Sure.
And then I have a quick story, and then I want to ask you a final question. That's sort of where we're at. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think truly it is about that. What are those effective grassroots efforts? So I love what you just said there, that, here's the reasons not where you don't go in that direction. But I'd love to hear, some of those other ways that you feel people can contribute to fighting this particular sort of reality. and getting change to happen?
That's a great question. That's if you want me to be really frank, that is the absolute weakest part of my book, because I talk about in the final chapter, here are the things you can do to participate in the political process to try and get this stuff done. And now we're at a good spot, which I wasn't necessarily sure that we were going towards a new government, and one that would promise reform. And so now we're at a bit of a sweet spot where maybe you doing some of those things that I suggest in the book might actually, again, fall on fertile ground. So again, it might be the weakest part of my book, but that's only because you have limited options in terms of what you can do to effect change at the government level. But now might be the time exactly to do that stuff,
Yeah, I think it is. And you put me to this funny story my old man tells me about. There was I think it was Kenny Hooper down in Blacks Harbor. But if there's people listening from Charlotte County, I apologize if I'm getting the facts of this a little bit wrong. But anyway, he owned a bar. It was on the edge of the village. And every year, we got to do this. We can't pay these taxes. My assessment's too high, blah, 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 blah. So he just every year. And the whole building, he had this bar on out near the highway system, I believe, coming off the highway into Black. The whole time, like he was winning. He was getting assessments lowered. He was getting, his tax rate lowered. Oh, I'll never sell my building for this, and blah blah blah. Doing exactly what you said. Oh, I'd never sell my building for that price. So this assessment's too high and all that. And then came time for I think it was the highway. It could have been. I don't think it was a school or anything like that. I think it was a highway going through, and they expropriated his property and needed to put it on that part of the land. And then all of a sudden they're like, well, your property assessment says the building's worth $40,000. So here's your $40,000. And well, I can't possibly replace my building for $40,000. Like, it just flipped the other way. Right. So be careful what you wish for. At the end of the day, nobody owns their house, right? It's like we steward them. We live in it for 20 years, 50 years, whatever it is. And that building is going to serve more people. And if you're not, if the government needs your house, they can take it. That's just how it works.
Yeah. Oh, that's the crown. The crown technically owns all of it.
Yeah.
Perhaps once our Indigenous brethren in New Brunswick go to court, perhaps that might change a little bit, and that might be real interesting and good stories. So, you had one more question for me, you said?
Yes. What do you think is like what changes here? If you get your way and they open this up in 3 years from now, like what do you think is going to be the legacy of that? If we change those pieces, let's say we hit the home run and we get those tax legislations reformed, we get some good policy put in place, we get some municipal financing. Like, how does it influence or how does it impact, you think, some of these broader societal problems we're having?
I'd like to think that if people can take their focus away from being angry about the way our property tax system works, even if they don't necessarily understand what's wrong with it, they know there's something wrong with it. If we get away from that, maybe that'll allow us to focus on the things that really matter to people, like housing, which you always so well discuss. And I'm hoping if you can put that stuff aside, you can talk about the other issues. In Alberta, we talked about a lot of things that were crappy, but they were the issues that deserved to be talked about. There wasn't a lot of talk about property tax and assessments in Alberta. That was almost never the issue, but there was lots of talk about those other issues. So perhaps it'll go in that direction. I don't want New Brunswick to be a mini Alberta, but on the tax and assessment side, there's something to be learned there for sure. It
makes sense.
I have a small finish to this, if you don't mind.
Absolutely.
They didn't know quite what the facts is as they screamed about property taxes. Nowhere could they see how the system should be, so they called it assessment malpractice. Thanks for having me.
Oh my gosh, that's a beautiful ender. Thank you, Jerry, for that was beautiful. Beautiful poetry.
You can't top that ending. That's crazy. That's so good.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for joining us this week, Jerry. I'm sure we'll have you back soon as we hear more about what the Liberals are rolling out.
It's an honor, you guys. Anytime.
No, you're the best. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry.
Yes.
watching Rogers TV.